even if it's not bad enough for Bitcoin, it's still bad enough for American Bitcoiners. As American Bitcoiners, that we can be pressured and we can have issues against us. We obviously don't want a hostile environment.
Like many other prominent investors and analysts in the field, Lyn Alden is a well-known macro analyst, investment strategist, and sound money advocate. She is a strong Bitcoin bull and has grown even more bullish on the leading cryptocurrency as a result of what she describes as multiple bullish factors coming together for a super bullish year for Bitcoin in 2025. Alden anticipates a very busy year for both the US and global economies, with global liquidity serving as the main driver of Alden's bullishness. Real Vision founder and CEO Raoul Pal, for example, is anticipating a massive explosion in global liquidity in 2025, starting with the US Federal Reserve and other major central banks announcing rate cut later this year.
I think he knows the momentum of where things are going, so I don't think he personally has a big reason to be against it. It doesn't mean he'll necessarily go. He might not do all of his campaign promises that he made, but I think it's less likely he would turn hostile on it at this point. It's possible. Anything is possible. I don't think you should ever kind of trust a politician. They're all like on both sides right now. They're in their pandering election
Yeah.
campaigning environment now. One thing I did point out to your point is that even though a lot of the headline speakers were from the right side of the political spectrum, there were a number of politicians there from the left side of the political spectrum. And during the conference, a bunch of them even wrote to the DNC and
Yeah.
said, like, this party has to kind of get up to speed on this a little bit better because this is not like the right way of doing things. It's putting, votes and fundraising and things like that at risk. And the reason that's important is because, when you think of like major tail risks that could really impair or otherwise disrupt Bitcoin adoption. One of them would be a very hostile U.S. government. And even if it's
Hmm.
not, even if it's not bad enough for Bitcoin, it's still bad enough for American Bitcoiners. As American Bitcoiners, that we can be pressured and we can have issues against us. We obviously don't want a hostile environment. And so when we look back at, for example, when they banned gold in the 1930s, people often bring that example up as though like as though the government's a monolith and can just decide to do things. Whereas back then they had a super majority, right? They
Hmm.
basically there was such a kind of a collectivist concentration of power at once that they were able to do rather extreme things by American standards. Whereas in the current environment, as long as there's kind of enough political pressure that there's not any sort of supermajority against Bitcoin, then it's at least somewhat shielded from some of the kind of the worst outcomes. If you have, say, a majority of Republican lawmakers are either kind of neutral or for it, and then you have a minority of Democratic lawmakers that are kind of neutral or for it, then it's hard to do any sort of like really anti-Bitcoin draconian type of legislation. And there's more levers to kind of push back on should they attempt it. So I think that's why that at least some degree of bipartisanship is relevant to be aware of and to promote. So I'm not tied enough into politics to have an opinion about that specific administration. I don't know what she's going to decide or her vice president. I don't know what route they would go there. I do think in general that there's a pretty significant minority foothold in the Democratic Party. So I kind of focus on that rather than try to speculate what this specific administration should do, or even if they're going to win. We don't really know which way
Yeah.
it's going to
In a
turn out
recent
again.
interview with Natalie Brunell, Alden predicts that 2025 will see much higher prices for Bitcoin due to the upcoming massive liquidity pump and other bullish factors like the spot Bitcoin ETFs that have been drawing billions of dollars from traditional investors. He also talks about the recent global stock market catastrophe, the frantic response to it, and the factors that contributed to the market's rapid recovery. Since the Japanese carry trade issue is now entirely behind us, Alden argues that the market's response and recovery were both quick since the entire matter was exaggerated. Alden is predicting nothing but bull for Bitcoin in the coming months, especially after central banks start cutting and the expected liquidity spikes start, as we bring you excerpts from enlightening debate.
So during reserve accumulation, that generally is used by countries, ironically, to weaken their currency to a certain extent. And so, for example, if a country is running a really big, say, trade surplus, so a lot of value is flowing in, some of the things they'll do, like for example, Switzerland did this. They'll keep buying reserve assets. They'll basically keep printing their own currency, buying reserve assets, so that their currency doesn't appreciate too much, so they can kind of run those mercantilist policies. Technically, the United States could do similar. They could print a lot of dollars and buy any number of reserve assets. It could be gold, could be Bitcoin, could be foreign bonds or equities, whatever they want, really. And the interesting thing is that the United States actually has a much smaller amount of reserves as a percentage of GDP than most other countries. And it's because we are like the axiom of the system, and
Mm-hmm.
so we don't really have reserve assets other than a fairly small amount of gold when it's compared to
Yeah.
GDP. Most countries have much bigger reserves because they need them and they use that as stability. So it is there is a case to be made that the United States could just become like any other country and go from, say, having reserves of 2% of GDP to 5 or 10%, which would kind of bring them in line with a number of other developed countries. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm kind of neutral on the topic because obviously the upside is there's a little bit more political shielding from that. It would probably be good for price. It would send a very positive signal to other countries to go ahead and do the same thing. So if you want to enter, a new stage of price appreciation and scale and probably lower volatility, um, that's probably a good thing. But on the other hand, I think all else being equal, I'd rather have individuals accumulate
Mm-hmm.
before governments get in. I like to have more time to see other ones go in. I think the key takeaway is we can't really control who buys it or who figures it
Yeah.
out. I would certainly say that anyone running a pool of capital, that if they were to figure it out, obviously from their perspective, the rational thing is to then go buy it. It's possible. It's very there's still a lot to restructure. But I mean, for example, if I was in charge of the treasury and it was my job to determine whether or
Mm-hmm.
not we should accumulate Bitcoin, I would say, of course, let's accumulate Bitcoin. If possible, I even want to do it in secret to get a significant
Mm-hmm.
position rather than move the price before we actually buy much of it. So I'd have to kind of just work to see what's possible. Basically, whatever seat you find yourself in, if you're running capital and you end up, appreciating the aspects of Bitcoin, it makes sense from whatever seat you're running in to then go and buy it. You'd have to, the United States would have to buy a pretty significant amount and get a pretty significant price appreciation to really make a dent
Yeah.
in the debts and deficits.
Yeah.
I mean, around the margins, every little thing like that can help. So yeah, two different time frames there. I never really try to predict a quarter or two ahead because there's any number of idiosyncratic events. I do think as we look out to 2025, I'm pretty bullish. I don't really have a strong opinion for the remainder of this year. We were kind of trading in that 60 to 70,000 range for a while. Lately, we've been dipping into the upper 50s, which is not great.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, especially once we turn to a more pro liquidity environment, if we see the Fed eventually layering in some gradual rate cuts, if we do get kind of that transition from balance sheet shrinking to balance sheet growing, even if it's not at a rapid pace, as those things occur, later this year and then probably for the balance sheet next year, that should probably help global liquidity. And one thing I point out a number of times is that the best correlate that I've seen for Bitcoin price is global liquidity. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
only correlate, but it's among things I track that's
Yeah.
both logically and then in practice one of the better correlates. And since I expect probably global liquidity to go higher in 2025,
Mm-hmm.
and given all the other characteristics we see about Bitcoin at the time, I'm pretty bullish. As far as those really long-term forecasts, one thing to keep in mind is that they were not like inflation adjusted. And so some of the in for like Michael Saylor, for example, he gave that talk about the
Yeah.
I think the 21-year price forecast, which is a nice
Yes.
touch. Um, and like if I recall correctly, his base case was something like Bitcoin becomes 7% of global assets, up
Mm-hmm.
from effectively like a tenth of a percent or whatever it is now.
Yeah.
And so while that is obviously a huge run up, that's basically a 70x appreciation in terms of percentage of total assets. It's not as though Bitcoin has taken over the world in that scenario. So basically, in
Yeah.
21 years, can it go from 0.1% to 7%? I don't really view that as like an outrageous possibility. And that was his base case. And the way that you kind of can arrive at that is something, now depending on what source you reference, total global assets are, somewhere close to $250 billion, which is a really funny number, 1,000 trillions. I think it's something like 900 trillion, right?
Uh-huh.
That's kind of the
Yeah.
baseline. And over time, when you um, go through growth and inflation for another 21 years, That number is going to be a lot higher. That's going to be a number of quadrillions, like thousands of trillions. And
Yeah.
then as Bitcoin goes from, whatever tiny sub 1% it is now up to, some, presumably higher number of percentage, that's how you get those multi-million dollar numbers.
Raoul Pal's everything code theory says that central banks should keep their economies going by printing money on a regular basis to stop the kind of widespread sovereign debt collapse that we were very close to during the great financial crisis. This theory fits perfectly with Lyn Alden's prediction of a coming rise in global liquidity. Powell thinks that we can perfectly time both boom and bear markets by watching what central banks do. Natalie Alden told Alden that the apex banks have been pulling out liquidity for the past 2 years, and the markets can't take the pressure any longer before something really bad happens. Alden thinks that this will be very good for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as a result. This means that the quantitative tightening measures are almost over. Now is the time for some much-needed loosening to keep things from getting too hot. Thanks for watching.